More than 50 million people, Anne-Marie, from Iowa to California have been under these excessive heat warnings. And in California and Texas, people are being told to conserve electricity to prevent rolling blackouts. This all happened during a historic drought and increasing risks of wildfires. CBS News national correspondent Jonathan Vigliotti has more.
That over there used to be islands.
For Brianna Ramirez, it's hard to believe this is the same lake her family used to take their boat out on.
We need water to survive, and it's scary. It really is.
Severe lack of winter snow and rain and this week's punishing heat wave have transformed Lake Mendocino into a desert, causing Ramirez to rethink how she uses the water she does have.
We're telling our kids, hey, you can only take this amount long of a shower, cutting back, loads of laundry.
Across 12 states, tens of millions of Americans have endured sweltering temperatures of 100 or above.
This western state heat dome is a dramatic reminder that Mother Nature bats last and she bats 1,000.
But with the first day of summer still days away, another big concern for Brianna Ramirez is fire season. Last year, flames destroyed more than 4 million acres across California, setting a new record. This year's excessive heat is already fueling brush fires throughout the state. Lake Mendocino was once a reliable source with water to dump on flames.
It seems like this really highlights what is going to be a volatile wildfire season for you.
During the past seasons, I've sat here with my kids and watched the planes pick up water out of the lake, and there's nothing. It makes me wonder, is this what we have to look forward to? Is it going to recover from this?
Thousands rallied across dozens of cities in Brazil to denounce President Jair Bolsonaro's handling of the pandemic, marching through the streets of Rio de Janeiro to the sound of drum beats and to the chant of indigenous tribes in the capital, Brasilia. They called for Bolsonaro's impeachment, accusing him of still downplaying the COVID-19 pandemic, despite Brazil's death toll being the second largest in the world. When the protests began in Rio, the coronavirus had already killed more than 498,000 Brazilians. As the day wore on, Brazil reached the tragic milestone of 500,000 dead.
This government's responsible for genocide. It delayed the vaccination rollout. We cannot continue to be governed by a president who doesn't care about Brazilian lives.
Just last week, Bolsonaro was fined for leading a motorbike rally in São Paulo without wearing a mask. He's already on the campaign trail for next year's presidential election and continues to promote hydroxychloroquine as a cure for the coronavirus.
I'm 65 years old, was infected by COVID-19 and took hydroxychloroquine. The next day I was cured.
Bolsonaro's opponents had been reluctant to take to the streets against him, arguing that people should stay home in the midst of a pandemic. Now they say it's riskier to remain quiet.
We're here to fight for our lives. The virus is less deadly than our president. We want him out now.
This is happening while a Senate committee is still investigating the government's handling of the pandemic. Senators, doctors, and scientists say they suspect the government has tried to achieve herd immunity by infection.
There's the suspicion that every scientist in Brazil now has. And the president of Brazil is doing everything he can to convince us that that's his strategy since the beginning. When he goes and says that immunization produces a protection that is smaller than if you have the disease, which is not true.
Meanwhile, an average 2,000 Brazilians have been dying every day, and many fear that, at this rate, Brazil may soon surpass the United States as the country with the world's largest COVID-19 death toll. Monica Yanakiev, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
New beds for COVID-19 patients filled as quickly as they're opened. The virus is spreading rapidly in Moscow. Patients are younger, their symptoms more severe.
My lungs are functioning at 40%.
Here, the Delta variant, first discovered in India, has become the dominant strain. In 10 days, the number of COVID cases has tripled, with a record 9,000 new infections daily.
Unfortunately, unvaccinated patients are showing up. Vaccination remains the most effective way to protect oneself.
Only 11% of Russians are believed to be fully vaccinated. Faced with a hesitant population, authorities are putting away the carrot and taking out the stick. Shops and restaurants must have 60% of their employees vaccinated by July 15th or face fines.
I can only agree with this. If people don't want to get vaccinated and it's necessary, this is the only solution.
Employees who refuse can be put on mandatory unpaid leave.
I think everyone should have the freedom to get vaccinated or not.
Another factor in the latest wave, lax attention to sanitary measures. The requirement to wear a mask indoors is widely ignored. Authorities make a show of enforcing some measures, but they are largely symbolic, including the closure of the Euro soccer fan zone or restaurants, but only after 11 p.m.
The Delta variant, first discovered in India, is making itself at home in Europe. In Britain, it's responsible for new infection numbers soaring past 11,000 in a single day and doubling every 11 days. Hospital admissions are rising, though deaths remain low. That's because the success of the vaccine rollout means the elderly and vulnerable are protected, leaving mainly young adults to get it, and they tend to be less susceptible to serious illness. In countries where vaccine rollout is less advanced, the risk is greater. The Russian capital, Moscow, has seen daily infections rise by 30% this week, prompting an extension of restrictions and a rebuke of public behavior from the Kremlin.
Total nihilism and the low vaccination level were behind the surge. We must also not forget the cunning of the infection itself.
Only 1/8 of the country's population has been vaccinated with Russia's own Sputnik vaccine, and it's now become mandatory for those in public-facing work like retail, education, healthcare and public transport to get the jab. Elsewhere in the EU, where vaccination programs have escalated after a slow start, restrictions are being eased and holiday travel is back on in the hope of a post-COVID summer. European football championship matches are drawing big crowds, but the Delta variant may have other ideas, and countries like Germany are warning that it could become the dominant strain continent-wide by the autumn.
US President Joe Biden set out to reassure NATO leaders of Washington's commitment to the alliance as he arrived for his first summit of the 30-member group in Brussels.
But I want to make it clear, NATO is critically important for U.S. interest in and of itself. If there weren't one, we'd have to invent one.
Clearly enjoying the moment, Biden sought to rebuild trust after 4 years of Donald Trump. The former US leader was openly hostile to NATO, once even threatening to pull out. The military withdrawal from Afghanistan, climate change and NATO's future are on the agenda, but relations with Russia and China dominated discussions.
China's growing influence and international policies presents challenges to alliance security.
Joe Biden succeeded in persuading NATO to back his administration's push for a tougher approach to China, regarded by Washington as a major economic and strategic rival. But for most NATO allies, Russia remains the main threat. Relations between Moscow and NATO are at their lowest point since the Cold War. On Wednesday, Biden is scheduled to meet Russian leader Vladimir Putin for highly anticipated talks in Geneva.
I shared with our allies that I'll convey to President Putin, that I'm not looking for conflict with Russia, but that we will respond if Russia continues its harmful activities.
Ties with Turkey are also tense, but Biden called a meeting with the Turkish president productive. The US may be back as a reliable NATO partner, but this analyst says some allies have concerns.
The allies here, as in Asia, will remember that Trump had happened, that something like him could happen again in the future.
There are divisions in NATO on some issues, but those differences remained mainly behind closed doors. As Biden took centre stage, leaders were clearly determined to turn a diplomatic page and show a united front.
I did what I came to do.
Returning to the White House overnight, President Biden seemed pleased after his 3-hour summit with Russian President Putin.
The tone of the entire meeting's good, positive.
The two leaders emerged with some potential compromises. They planned to start a strategic dialogue on the future of nuclear weapons and discuss the fate of American prisoners being held in Russia.
The question about American citizens that were in Russian prisons, we discussed that. There could be some compromise.
I'm not going to walk away on that.
But the two signaled they're still at odds over issues like cybersecurity and human rights. Putin has a history of quashing dissent and jailing political enemies like Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who's been imprisoned for months. Putin refused to even utter Navalny's name.
This person knew that he was breaching the laws effective in Russia.
While the president warned of what could happen if Navalny dies in prison.
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia.
Putin also said political dissent in his country could lead to what he called America's disorder, slamming everything from gun violence to the Black Lives Matter movement.
What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc.
And he equated arresting political protesters with the arrests of rioters at the January 6th Capitol attacks.
That's a ridiculous comparison. They're very different criteria.
Putin also refused to acknowledge Russia's role in recent cyber attacks on American critical infrastructure.
I think just throwing out these insinuations at the expert level, that's inappropriate.
Mr. Biden said he gave Putin a list of 16 U.S. infrastructure sectors like energy and water systems and airports that he says are off limits to attacks.
And if in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond.
President Biden said the world will find out within a few months if any of Putin's promises will hold, but he lost his temper when asked why he seemed confident that Putin could change his behavior.
Hey, what do you do over there? So when did I say I was confident?
He later apologized.
I shouldn't have been such a wise guy with the last answer I gave.
Two executives at Hong Kong newspaper Apple Daily were charged with collusion with foreign forces on Friday under the city's draconian national security law. This was one day after more than 200 police raided the newsroom of the pro-democracy newspaper. Police cited 30 articles published by the newspaper in Chinese and English. It's not the first crackdown on Apple Daily. Police also raided the newsroom last August, frog-marching the paper's owner Jimmy Lai in front of staff. The 73-year-old is now serving a 20-month sentence for illegal assembly and faces life in prison under the national security law. The defiant newspaper did a massive print run on Friday, with Hong Kongers turning out in droves to pick up copies. A small act of resistance, but many here fear that Apple Daily's days could be numbered as the climate for journalism in the city becomes increasingly hostile. In 10 years, Hong Kong has dropped 46 places in Reporters Without Borders press freedom standings.
Tokyo is stepping up preparations ahead of the Olympics. Meanwhile, a clash between German police and squatters suddenly turned violent. Chris Lipsey is following these stories and other international news from Rome. Chris, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. Yeah, let's start right here in Europe, where that riot at a squat building in Berlin has left dozens of police officers wounded. The police were trying to carry out a fire inspection, but instead were greeted with a barrage of stones from the rooftop and objects set ablaze in the streets, injuring 60 officers. The violence could lead to evicting the occupants from one of the city's last remaining squats. Now, previous efforts to clear it have also led to violent protests. The occupied building is located in the Friedrichshain neighborhood, which has rapidly gentrified. Now to Mexico City, where we've been tracking that deadly subway crash last month. Now city officials are blaming flaws in construction. The Public Works Department says it found deficiencies in building materials and structural supports along the metro line. But more reports are on the way in the coming months. The disaster killed 26 people and sparked protests in the capital, putting pressure on Latin America's richest man, billionaire Carlos Slim. It was his construction firm involved in building the section of the subway line that collapsed. Now to the world of soccer, where new allegations say Argentine football legend Diego Maradona was killed by his negligent doctors. That's according to a lawyer for one of his nurses. But that same lawyer is one of the 7 people under investigation for manslaughter and accusations Maradona received poor care after undergoing brain surgery for a blood clot. Maradona died weeks later of a heart attack last November. And we end in Japan, where the government announced it will lift Tokyo's COVID-19 emergency this Sunday, 1 month before it hosts the Summer Olympic Games. Tokyo, the capital, along with several other parts of the country, has been under a virus emergency since April 25th, banning restaurants and bars from selling alcohol and forcing them to close early. The new measures would loosen that and are expected to set a cap of 10,000 spectators or 50% capacity at large events, whichever is smaller. The Games open on July 23rd and will be the biggest international event since the start of the pandemic, despite the fact that fans from overseas have been banned from attending. Now, organizers there have been under heavy scrutiny just for allowing the games to go forward, considering risks surrounding an outbreak of COVID-19 are still very much a reality. Anne-Marie?
Indeed, and their vaccine rollout has not been the best over there. Chris, thank you very much.
I definitely do know that there were incendiary balloons launched from Gaza into Israel, and I do know there were fires caused as a result in fields across the south of Israel. I know also that at the moment, there are no reports of injuries coming out of Gaza. So we've seen limited airstrikes in response to incendiary balloons, and at this stage, it looks like something that no one was expecting, frankly, but not a major escalation. At the end of the Gaza hostilities that ended 21 days ago, the IDF did say that if there were anything came across, an incendiary balloon, a rocket, no matter what it was, there would be a response. And perhaps that is why we have seen this response tonight.
And Iris, there's a new Prime Minister in Israel. Tell us more about Naftali Bennett's stance on that recent flare-up you just described between Israel and Gaza.
Naftali Bennett is known to be a hardliner and a right-wing, definitely a right-wing leader. His party is called Yamina, to the right. But he does not rule by himself. He has a coalition of 8, which includes leftists, centrists, as well as right-wingers, and an Arab party for the first time ever in Israel's history. We heard from the leader of this Arab party today describing the march in Jerusalem, which I was present at. He described it as a provocation and said it shouldn't have been allowed. And you have to say, looking at the events of the 24 hours, that it has already produced an escalation. And it's interesting that that march was agreed to by the previous administration, by the outgoing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, throwing this hot potato into the first 2 days of the new government's rule. So I think it's significant politically, and I think it's also significant, of course, from the point of view of the escalation.
The explosion occurred shortly after 3 p.m. local time. Authorities say at least 2 bombs detonated minutes apart after a man pretending to be soldiers drove a truck into the military base used by Colombia's 30th Army Brigade in the border town of Cúcuta. A cloud of black smoke was seen rising from the facility as ambulances rushed to the scene of the blast. Dozens of people have been injured, some are in critical condition. Meanwhile, Colombia's defense minister has described the blast as an act of terror, adding that authorities are investigating the potential involvement of 2 rebel groups.
The initial hypothesis is that the ELN, the National Liberation Army, is behind this vile act. We are also investigating the involvement of FARC dissidents.
The government has yet to provide any evidence, but both groups have been accused of carrying out similar attacks in recent years. In 2019, the National Liberation Army set off a car bomb at a police academy in the capital, Bogota, killing more than 20 people and putting an end to negotiations with the government. Despite signing a historic peace deal in 2016, a group of dissident FARC rebels who rejected the accord remain active and could be behind a bomb attack in the Cauca province last March. Both the ELN and the FARC are present in the North Santander state, the border with Venezuela. Criminal gangs are also believed to be operating in the area, smuggling fuel, drugs, and weapons.
Quand j'étais à 10 ans, j'étais parti à l'école. Quand mes parents n'ont pas assez l'argent, je suis sorti, je venais les aider au champ, au travail.
Il y a longtemps qu'on sensibilise, mais tant qu'on ne donne pas un signal fort, on puisse sanctionner un parent qui emploie son enfant à des travaux dangereux, ça va toujours continuer. Donc il faut qu'on donne des signaux.
Nous accueillons les enfants avec beaucoup de sourires pour les mettre en confiance, des échanges aussi. Et nous faisons une écoute initiale. Cette écoute nous permet de déceler si l'enfant est en situation de traite ou pas. Après cela, s'il est avéré en situation de traite ou de travail, nous engageons une médiation qui permet de rechercher des familles. Lorsque nous avons ces familles avec nous, la médiation consiste à échanger avec ces familles et de permettre la possibilité à l'enfant de retourner dans sa famille biologique.
This was once Alege Haile Mariam's shelter in this refugee camp before winds and heavy rains brought it down 2 weeks ago. A farmer from Humera in Ethiopia's Tigray region, he says he stayed despite the fighting that started last November. But when his livelihood was threatened, he was forced to leave his farm and come to Sudan's Gadaref state.
The Amhara militia came and burned our farms that we planted and were waiting to harvest. And they stole everything. I wanted to stay, but there was no food, and they were preventing aid from reaching us, so I came here to seek security and to get food.
Alege says he believes the burning of farms was done to force Tigrayans like himself into starvation. The conflict between the Ethiopian government and the regional Tigray People's Liberation Front has killed thousands and internally displaced more than 2 million over the past 7 months. 350,000 people in the region are facing famine, according to the United Nations, which says that starvation is being used as a weapon of war. The United States has described the conflict as ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans. At least 70,000 Tigrayans have fled to Sudan since the start of the fighting. The number of refugees arriving in camps here in Sudan have reduced compared to when the conflict broke out in Tigray. But those who managed to cross the border say it's not because conditions have improved back home. They say Tigrayans continue to be targeted because of their ethnicity, and many atrocities are being reported. And while they come seeking refuge, conditions here are far from ideal. Saga Teklai was one of the first to arrive in this camp, which opened at the start of the year. The shelter she was given, like hundreds of others, has collapsed as a result of terrible weather conditions. She says she shares accommodation with other refugee families. And while she receives aid, it's not enough for her and her family. She's now suffering from malnutrition and is unable to nurse her 16-month-old daughter.
We're given flour and oil, but it's not enough for us. My daughter keeps crying for milk, but I don't have any to give her. So I give her rice to keep her stomach full, but that's not enough to cover the nutrients she needs, and I worry about her health.
Aid organizations say hundreds of severe and moderate malnutrition cases have been recorded in the 4 refugee camps established to accommodate the refugees. And camp authorities say access to health care to treat malnutrition as well as other diseases is limited. And with the rainy season starting, they are concerned about the welfare of the refugees.
Those who are suffering from aid shortages need to make sure all their needs are met with the rainy season starting. We've already seen shelters falling and many people left out in the open again, with some suffering from malnutrition. We can see more and more refugees getting sick. The situation is dire and we need aid organizations to step up.
Alege says he'll work to fix his shelter until he gets a better one. But he says, looking at the life he's living now, he wishes the conflict back home would end so he can go back to his farm and to the life he's left behind. Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera, Tanedba Camp, Gaddarif State.
Early morning at Jeju's busiest fish market, and as the last of the night's catch is brought ashore, bidding at the auction inside is brisk. With much of this fish destined for dinner tables across South Korea, the industry provides a living for thousands here. And the prospect of Japan releasing water from its stricken Fukushima nuclear power plant fills many with dread.
If the safety of the water can be completely verified, then it might be okay. If not, it's gravely concerning and we have to stop it.
Since the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that crippled the Fukushima plant, water used to cool its reactor cores has been stored on site. The plant's operators say it's been treated to remove virtually all contamination, leaving just one radioactive isotope in such minute quantities it poses no risk to health. The Japanese government insists the release of the water is perfectly safe and is similar to routine discharges made by nuclear plants the world over. But as fishing communities around Fukushima have found in the 10 years since the disaster, just the fear of radiation can devastate livelihoods. The planned water release won't start for another 2 years, giving time for lawyers like J.C. Moon, the first in South Korea to file a lawsuit on the fishing community's behalf, to try to make the Japanese government think again.
If similar lawsuits are also filed in other parts of South Korea and in district courts across China, we believe it could put considerable psychological and diplomatic pressure on Japan.
Any legal challenges against a foreign government face an uphill battle, but they could be helped by data from this laboratory. It's beginning to test for radiation to check against Japan's safety guarantees.
In preparation for Japan's release of contaminated water, we'll be conducting tests on fish caught off the coast and from fish farms.
An island economically dependent on the waters that surround it, and now actively preparing for what many here consider an irresponsible act that they hope won't come at all. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Jeju Island, South Korea.
It was the first time the General Assembly made its position known on Myanmar since the country's coup 4.5 months ago. Secretary General Antonio Guterres pressed member states for a strong message.
We cannot live in a world where military coups become a norm. It is totally unacceptable.
The text was adopted with 119 votes in favor, 1 against, and 36 abstentions, including some countries from the region.
External blind pressure or imposition of sanctions on Myanmar is not only ineffective, but, quite on the contrary, it might aggravate the issue.
The resolution calls for the release of state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners, an end to violence against peaceful demonstrators, and humanitarian access. Notably, it also calls for member states to stop weapons from getting into the country. But only the Security Council has the power to impose an arms embargo, and so far, veto-wielding powers China and Russia have opposed targeted sanctions. The General Assembly resolution was sponsored by some 60 countries, including Canada.
Get the country on a path to democracy. That's a very, very clear message to the junta, and it's a message that says, stop the atrocities, let's deal with the need for democracy as soon as we can. And the delay has gone on for several months. Let's move forward.
Myanmar's ambassador to the UN, an outspoken critic of the military, says the resolution doesn't go far enough.
We are so disappointed that it took almost 3 months to adopt this watered-down resolution, even though it does not include many important points to save lives of the people in Myanmar.
The General Assembly, where every country has a vote and no country has veto power, has now weighed in.